Hey y'all, Lossien here. Join me on a quest today as we turn all of this into this. The final piece of costume that we're making is Keyleth's boots. To do this, we're going to start off by making the mock-up and the pattern at the same time. Then we're going to make all our alterations from that pattern, cut it out of the good fabric, and finally sew it all together. Sewing it all together also includes gluing it to the base shoe, so by the end you have one boot, or two in this case, that looks like you made the pair from scratch. So to make Keyleth's boot cover pattern, I actually had to put on the shoe that I was going to cover. I got my shoe from a secondhand store. It's just a heel made in a suede material. A suede is great because you can actually attach it right to the boot with barge or any sort of contact cement, and it sticks way easier than like a pleather. Then I took my fabric that was longer than I needed it to be, and I put it on my leg, pinning it up the back. I started at the very bottom, making sure it was longer and went just over the heel part of the actual shoe. I was going to leave the heel as visible because it was a dark brown, and it looked right with my fabric choices. I actually pinned directly into the boot for this part to make sure that it wasn't going to shift on me. I did clip it, give it a little notch in the front so that it spread properly along the back. Then I pinned all the way up my leg, up the back because I wanted the seam to be in the back. Now keep in mind that I am wearing jeans with this, so that there is some sort of pant underneath, but I'm not going to accidentally pin into my actual Keyleth pants. Jeans are a little more robust, so this was easier. Now, as I pinned all the way down, I realized that I couldn't quite pull it taut enough or tight enough so that it would actually have the shaping that I wanted. So I pinned all the way down, making it as flat as possible, and then I realized that I needed to add a little dart in the front on the bottom part of my shin because of the shaping of my leg. You may not have to do this, everyone's leg is different. I like to shape it on me personally to make sure that it's going to fit properly. Once I had that all pinned all the way down, I took another piece of scrap fabric and I ended up attaching it on the actual foot part. You can see I folded back the material to have a straight line on each side. I took my next piece and I pinned it along that flat seam that I had just made, pinning it across, making it as flat as possible so it was almost like a continuation of the fabric, just in a slightly different direction. I pinned it all the way across, making sure it was as tight across the top, the center line as possible. Then I realized I had to put a little dart in that center spot again. So, once it was pinned in, I went along the top and pinched the fabric, especially around the toe. It gave like a curved dart to cover the toe, and I had to cover the top part of the foot, just putting a new dart along that line again, that center line, so that the entire foot had a line up the very center. Then I went through and marked where all of my pins were. So this meant I marked where my center darts were on the top and the bottom, all the way down, and I marked up along the back so I knew exactly where all of my seams were. I also marked where that join was from the top fabric to the bottom fabric so that I could keep them together once it was all done and create one single piece. While the mock-up was still on my leg, I took out my reference pictures and, while looking at them extensively, drew on the lines at the very top of her boot. Those are the only decorative lines and where the different colors are. So I drew the very top edge, then I drew approximately what the shape was. Now I was working off of the reference material before the show came out, so I ended up with a semicircle instead of the pointed triangle, upside down triangle shape that she has in the actual series. And the last thing I did before the pattern was finished was I took a different color and I marked along the bottom where the shoe meets the sole of the shoe. I did this all along the fabric, so I knew exactly where the bottom edge was going to be. Because I had pinned into the actual boot, it made it so this was very accurate. And then it was time to take everything off. I unpinned my pattern from the boot itself, and then I unpinned at the top of the boot, making a mark so I knew exactly where that was. Up to about the wide part of my thigh, this is where I was going to have to put a zipper so I could slide the whole boot off. Once it was off, I was able to unpin the very back, and then I could lay it out flat-ish. The very bottom doesn't lay quite flat, but we have our marks to know where it goes. I unpinned all of the pins down the center front that dart where the shin was and towards the toe. And then I was able to use my ruler and draw that center front line, which was the middle of those darts we made. Once I had that center front line all the way down, I then went through and redrew on either side the darts all the way down, trying to make them as even as possible, and just to look nicer. Until we got to the very toe, my toe was a little off, side to side, because that's how I pinned it and that's the shape of the shoe, and that is okay. Don't try and force that to be perfect. Then I redrew the sides, well, the sides of the pattern, but the very back of the pattern, to make it nice and even looking because I had just drawn it where the pins were. I measured up one side and the other, trying to make sure that they were as even as possible. Mine was about 1/4 of an inch off, so I lowered one side and made a new mark for that. Then it was time to clean up the very top. I drew a new line that made the actual top all the way across with my ruler, because rulers are great at making things nicer looking than just doing them by eye. And then I measured down the length that I wanted that very top dark brown piece to be. I did that on both sides to make sure it was nice and even. And then I measured down for the second dark brown piece, which was quite slimmer. I carried that over to the other side to make sure that they were perfect. Then I actually knew that I wanted it to be a swoop and not a straight line. So I added the swoop in, measuring how much further down it was, so I could copy that on all of these new lines I had just done, so that they stayed the same width all the way through. Then I redrew the swoop by hand. Now, if you did it according to the actual series, then yours will be a triangle, which is way easier to draw. After that, it was a simple matter of adding all of my 3/4 inch seam allowance to all of the sides and the very bottom. As you can see, it is a little time consuming, but with a nice ruler, it can be a little faster. I also then cut all my extra fabric away because I find it much easier to use the pattern without all the extra fabric on it. Then I gave myself a 3/4 inch seam allowance along the very top line, which I highly recommend you do as well, and cut off the extra. Once that was done, it was time to cut the pattern into the actual pieces so that we could cut the fabric out. So, starting at the center line, I cut one side up, all of those seam lines we had drawn, where the darts would be. Then I cut on the other side of all those seam lines, all the way up to where my circle piece was at the top. I did not cut through the circle piece though, because I wanted that to be one piece instead of two. So then I cut along those lines we had just done on the top, our swoop, getting that nice shape in the center. And keeping in mind that all of these seams we're cutting now do not have any seam allowance, I then also cut along the top, because we're going to add them when we cut them out of the actual fabric and not at this point. I then took a moment to line up those lines that I knew made the bottom sit nicely with the main part of the foot, and pin them in place so they didn't shift, and they laid nice and flat now. For my boot covers, I knew that my main material, since it was just a lightweight quilting cotton, because it's what I had in my stash, was too lightweight to actually make the boot covers out of, so I decided I was going to use a fleece material as a lining. So I took one of my sides of my boots, the bottom main part, and then I took the piece with the swoop on it that went on top, placed it at the top line, and folded it over as if it had that center seam to give me one pattern piece basically. Now I just cut my extra seam allowance out at the very top and along that center line in the front there, but you can definitely draw the 3/4 inch seam allowance and then cut it. I just eyeballed it because I've done it so many times that for me, that's just as easy. Once those were cut, I was able to cut along that center back line and along the bottom line as well, because I already had drawn on the seam allowance on the actual pattern piece, so that was nice and easy. Then I found the material for the next piece, or found a spot on the material for the next piece, which was always a bit of a trouble, and I laid that pattern piece down just like I did last time, and I laid the next pattern piece that was above it down as well and folded it over as if it had a line down that center front. Then I added my seam allowance to the very front and the very top like we did last time and cut it all out. And then I had my lining done so I could move on to cutting out the actual fabric we were going to see for the finished boot. For my medium brown fabric, I laid it down, made sure it was folded in half, so I was cutting out 2 at once. And then I just laid down those bottom pattern pieces, added my seam allowance to the top edge and that center front line on both pieces. This time I actually drew it out. And then I just cut them out. It was fairly straightforward. The next piece to cut was the bottom of the dark brown pieces with that little swoop in. All I did is, again, making sure my fabric was folded in half, so I was cutting 2 at once. I laid down that piece as nicely as possible, pinned it because my dark brown is quite shifty, added my seam allowance along the top and bottom, and cut it out. And the last thing to cut out is the very top piece in the dark brown. So I laid this piece down on top of my material, making sure, again, my material was folded in half so that we were cutting out 2 at one time. I added the seam allowance to that bottom edge because it was already on the top edge and cut it out once, then laid it out a second time and cut it out again. I did this because I want it to be on the inside and the outside so that if it shifts around a bit, it's all dark brown. I also cut it out of the fleece material so that I had 2 in the end. You can see me just cutting it out once here because my fabric was on fold again. And that meant that it would be thick, just like the rest of the boot cover. So if you're not using any lining, you don't have to worry about cutting it out of your lining material. If you are, then I highly recommend cutting it out of that lining material as well, just to make sure that everything is the same. We're going to place down one side of the lining, right side up, so finished side up, and then put the other side on top. So we have a right and a left, so they are not the same piece being sewn together. We're going to match it up at the toes, and then sew all the way down that center seam, attaching them from the toe through the ankle all the way up to the top. And then we're going to clip it wherever it scoops in or out, because at one point we're going to press it open like that. Let's do the other one. Next step is doing the same thing with these. I laid the dark brown pieces on top so I can make sure I had the correct side matching up. Then I folded it down so it was good side to good side and pinned them at the seam allowance amount right in the center of that curve. I made sure my seam allowance on the back side of the medium brown was pressed open with my fingers. Then, starting at the center, I sewed all the way up the swoop and down the straight part. It's really hard to see because apparently my camera hated me, but here you can see on the straight part. Then I just did the same on the other side, starting at the center, attaching it around the bend, and then sewing down the straight part. I took my time really making sure that they matched up as much as possible, sewing a little bit, shifting the fabric, sewing a little bit. And then I'm going to top stitch it. Okay, there we go. This will stay up a bit more with the fleece in behind it, so this will be a little better. And now we're going to do it again on the other one. This is going to be a lot easier if you have a ham, because this is possible without one. It just is going to take a lot longer. And we want to iron all of the seams open. And it's the same on these. Then you're going to take your lining piece and put that on top. Your seam allowance should be facing up on both pieces. And then you pin them together. Make sure that you have the correct side lining on top. Everything should line up properly. So I'm matching up the bottom seams and that center seam. Now see, these all line up without any effort on my part. And we just have to do the same on the other one. So we got this. This is the edge we're going to be sewing, so we don't need this anymore. And basically, we want each pile to be a piece of 2 of the dark brown pieces, good sides together, and a piece of the lining material on top. Now you want to make sure that each pile faces a different way, because there's a long side versus a short side. You just make sure that the long side in this case is towards the top on the first piece and towards the bottom on the next. Okay, and then I'm just going to sew that seam allowance amount along the top edge. And then we're going to trim around the corner so it can actually pop the right way around. We'll do this one too. Then if you go between the 2 dark brown layers, you can fold it open and then flip it all so it's right way out, and that seam that you just sewed is all along the top. We're going to take this to the iron quickly and just press it so the right sides are out. We're on to the attachment of the top. First things first. So there's a good side and a bad side. The bad side is the side with the seam allowance that you can see. The good side is other side without. We're going to trim that up on all 3 layers. Then put it down good side to good side, making sure that that notch that you just cut lines up with the peak of the point on the boot cover. You're going to start at the center where they line up, and so all the way down one side, that seam allowance amount. So for me, that was 3/4 of an inch. And remember that you've got pins on the underside, so you really want to make sure that you don't sew through them. Okay, so trying to figure out exactly how high up this other side should be so that these will line up. Just putting in a pin across. And we're also going to check exactly where this should sit and put a pin across, because I want to really make sure that these top edges are as even as possible. Perfect. I like how that's looking. So then I'm going to trim the seam allowance. And then top stitch it. I'm going to put all my seam allowance pointing up because that to me looks right. And then repeat on the other side. So ideally you want to have two of the same zippers. I'm working completely from my stash, so I actually have two different zippers. But what I'm going to do is mark from the very bottom here to the top. Oh, it's that pin, that's perfect. And I'm going to baste from here to here with my two sides together. Baste being a really nice long stitch with my proper seam allowance. And we're not going to back tack at all. And then I'm going to sew from here down and from here up. I'm actually just going to sew a little bit and then we're going to fix it after, because this is going to get hard to do. So I just sewed for about 1 inch. And I will sew the complete bottom though. And we're going to open up this seam and press it flat, so I will be right back. Once that's pressed open, we are going to make sure our zipper's facing down. Line up the bottom with the bottom notch. And pin the zipper up, making sure that the middle of the zipper is the middle of that seam. And checking the other side to make sure everything's spread out as far as it should be. And we've got the foot that lets us sew to one side in. So we're going to start at the very top, sew all the way down one side as close to the zipper teeth as possible, as far down as we can go. Then we're going to switch over to the other side and sew back up while it's still in the machine. This is actually fairly difficult. In theory, this is easier to do before you sew the front seam together, but because we have so many fancy lines at the top of the front seam, I wanted to get that done while it was flat, and also because you do see those lines. So the trick to this is pull it down, and you make sure there's nothing underneath that it's being caught on. We're gonna have to take that pin out while we can. Okay, that's as far as I can get, so I'm going to back tack that. And flip to the other side of the zipper. And I can't start back quite as far as I did on that one. And we're just double checking that all that seam allowance and everything is pulled out as far as it can be. Now we're going to go up from the bottom, start here, and go around in a rectangular shape. The bottom is a little more open.
And then next, with all the good sides together, we're going to sew up that last of the back seam. So starting at that 1 inch that we sewed before we put in the zipper, you just, with a regular stitch, sew all the way up, taking your time to pin at the very top to make sure all the seam lines of the dark brown pieces line up and the very top edge lines up. After that, you can take a moment and trim the seam allowance at the very top, just so it's not so thick there. Oh, do make sure that all of your layers are in the right spot and you're sewing all 4 layers there, including your lining and the medium brown. Then flip it right side out.
And the last thing we need to do is seam rip where we basted where the zipper was. So in retrospect, I should have cut away the fleece from this part because it does make it really thick. There we go.
So I put my shoe back on and then the shoe cover so that I could turn it into one shoe. I pulled it down so everything was laying the way I wanted it to, and then I peeled back my medium gray layer so I could concentrate on the lining to begin with. I held the lining down and with my fingers felt exactly where the sole met the rest of the shoe. I drew up 1/8 of an inch from that line, so it was just on the shoe part, not at all on the sole part, and drew all the way around on the lining. Then I cut along that line with my scissors while I was airing it. You may have to take this off to cut it. And I just trimmed it so that the lining was slightly shorter than the shoe itself. This way, when we do our next step, there's no bits of fleece sticking out that you don't want. Once that was done, I folded the brown back down and held it taut so it was nice and tight across the shoe but not hurting me, and then pinned it right in that line between the sole of the boot, like the rubber part, and the rest of the boot. Very carefully so I didn't stab my foot, and I pinned it all the way around. Once it was pinned, I actually took a piece of chalk and marked that line all the way around so I knew exactly where it was when I took it off, and I had a very clearly defined line. I did do this for each shoe because each shoe is slightly different. Once that was all done, I unpinned everything because we had a mark as to where the bottom was, and I took the boot cover and boot off. And then looking at the very center back line, I just trimmed away the seam allowance of the lining so that it was up above the mark of where the brown was going to be on the shoe. That way it wasn't too thick and it wasn't in the way.
So the first thing I'm going to do is trim this so it's 1/2 inch to 1/4 inch from the edge that we've marked, and so that we don't have all these frizzy bits. So we're going to tuck all the fleece away as much as possible. Trim the fleece a little more on the heel. And then all we're going to do is fold this along the line and stitch it just in from that line. And I do mean just in. We're going like 1/8 of an inch up, keeping it folded along that chalk line. We're only folding it once, so you don't have to worry too much. Okay, so this will give us a nice clean edge when we attach it to the shoe. So we're going to do the other one as well. Second one, done. So now, I mean, probably don't do this on the same desk that you do all your sewing on, but you can tell I've done this for a while. The next step is gluing down the fleece. I'm going to start on the back. I've pinned the front, and I'm going to use barge, the contact cement. My barge is getting a little old, still usable. And the trick with barge is to put it on both sides. I'm trying to get it right down into the bottom. Now we want to wait for both of those to mostly dry. So while I'm waiting, I'm I'm going to start in on the other one. Also, you always want to wear protective gear when working with barge, the contact cement. It is dangerous. And whenever you're done working with barge, you also have to put it in a room with good ventilation so it can off-gas, which means it'll continue to make fumes for up to about 24 hours. This doesn't have to be perfect, this pinning in the front. It just gives me a rough idea to make sure that I have the right shoe cover on the right shoe, and give me a starting point for when I attach the heel. This is almost ready. A good way of testing is if you attach your arm to it, does it stick to your arm hair? And I would say it does not. This is the hard part because you don't want to attach it down until it's time, because once it attaches, it is hard to get up again. There we go. So next is going to be either side, and we're going to start with this side. I'm pretty much going down the center point, which will be along this seam. So if you only have one layer on the shoe, this is where we would attach it all the way down to the seam line that we sewed, and we would put it on that very edge and pin it so it doesn't shift on us. Because I have 2 layers, gluing the first layer and then we'll glue the second layer just along the bottom edge. I would do a test if you only have 1 layer thick of material, because sometimes the glue bleeds through and it's super obvious, and we do not want that. Okay, we're going to put that off to the side. So I'm doing the edge first. Then I can go back in, make sure this is laying flat, and attach it. There we go. This one's a little harder. You really want to make sure, like in this case, since the boot is smaller at the front, I want to make sure that's attached so that when I put my foot in, it doesn't come undone. Very carefully place this, trying to keep it as apart as possible. So now I'm just pulling down the actual shoe. And I'm going to start with the toe and just get around the curve. Make sure I get the shoe that's left in that little amount. I'm only going up about 1 inch or half an inch, not even. Making sure to really get on that edge. Going a little past the seam allowance. Really pressing it in to that seam, and I'm going to grab some pins. Pins I don't really care about as much, and I'm actually going to pin in along that line so that it cannot shift on me, because I really want to make sure that stays.
And just keep that pattern of gluing and pinning alternating between the 2 boots so that it has a chance to dry to the right amount before you attach them together. I like to do just the toe, then I do most of one side and then most of the other side, and then the very back on its own thing, taking the time to really make sure those pins go in where you want them to go.
So you can see a little bit of the green of the shoe underneath. Still here. It's very faint. I'm just gonna go back with once this is all dry tomorrow morning, I'm gonna go back with a dark brown Sharpie and just color that in, just so we don't get that pop of color. But from the top, you can't see anything. I just want it to look as good as possible.
So finish gluing and pinning your second boot, and then you want to find a place that has some airflow, not an enclosed room, where you can leave them for about 20 to 24 hours. This way they can off-gas, which means they're going to be creating fumes for that long, so you want it to be on a balcony, in a garage, someplace where you're not going to be. Once that's done and it's sat for 24 hours and you're positively sure it's attached, then you can take out all the pins. I ran the marker over the little bit of green that you can see, and the boots are done.
So overall, the boots turned out pretty good. I really like how they're sealed to the bottom. I wish that this brown material was stretchy. That's going to be my ongoing thing because they'd fit just a little better. It's really hard to deal with this not stretching. It tends to wrinkle down the bottom. I did end up going back and letting it out just a tiny bit. And in retrospect, like in some of the images, I'm watching it tonight, so I don't know. In some of the images, the point is actually right on the side. So they may not be the most accurate, but I was working off of pre-film pictures. And yeah, all in all, pretty good. I think in the summer, the shoes will fit better when I'm not wearing as thick socks. Snow. In the end, I'm gonna keep the boots. I'm like 95% pleased with them, which is really high for me in footwear. So yeah, thanks for coming on this journey with me. I can't wait to see what your boots look like. Send me images on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, all that jazz. I can't wait to see. Bye. I don't know how much, okay. Well, hello there. Persephone! I'm talking to the camera. She stretch. Hey, hey. Ah, ah. All my pins just fell. All of them.